Hello, good afternoon. How are we feeling, y'all? Thumbs up, thumbs down, in the middle? Oh my gosh, this is amazing. It must be all the great presenters that were before me. You know, they prepped you to be just so ready after lunch. Anywho, my name is Natalie Correa, and I will be talking to you all today about sketch mapping, fear, safety, and community for LGBTQ+ students amidst the rising anti-LGBTQ+ legislation. I know it may sound like a bummer, but we're gonna look at some really great maps, so I promise it won't be too sad. So the game plan for today is that we're gonna talk about some background stuff. We're gonna go over the inspiration for the method I used. We're gonna go into sketch mapping, the process. We'll talk about data compilation and concluding thoughts. And that little sticker there, support gay weddings, that was an actual sticker that people could get during the interviews. So as an overview, 510 state-level bills were introduced across the United States last year that negatively targeted members of the LGBTQ+ community. Currently in 2024, there have been 530 state-level bills introduced, and that doesn't count every single state since not every state is in a legislative year. There's been increased discussion amongst LGBTQ+ individuals about leaving their home states due to this legislation being introduced and actually passed. So this is a map that I made that is using ACLU data. They have a project called Mapping Attacks on LGBTQ+ rights. They have their own. This one, I wanted to highlight those more intense states since they do a whole kind of area of 16 to 55, and that's a big range, so it's broken up a little bit. We can see the distribution here of those proposed bills, and this is where they were actually passed last year. So 84 bills were passed into law across 23 states out of the 510 that were introduced. And as a review of the terms, LGBTQ+ is referring to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, with the plus meaning things outside of that, like intersex, asexual, etc. Transgender is being used as an umbrella term here, which includes people who adhere with the binary gender construct and those who don't. And when I say anti-LGBTQ+ legislation, I'm referring to bills and the subsequent laws that either specifically or indirectly restrict the rights, safety, or liberties of LGBTQ+ individuals, which can include restrictions on access to public accommodations like bathrooms, healthcare access, schools and education, access to accurate IDs, and among others. So my research question for this, and this was for context, my thesis for my undergrad last year at Hofstra. So the question is, where do LGBTQ+ college students perceive safety, fear, and community amid the rise of anti-LGBTQ+ legislation across the United States? Focusing on college students, not just because I had easy access to them, but also because they've already had to make that choice of, am I going to move away from where I grew up, or am I not? Am I staying, am I leaving? Some of them amidst this drastic rise of anti-LGBTQ+ legislation. So in thinking about this method, I went with sketch mapping, which I am using the definition of drawing on a map to represent lived experiences, which usually is done for small-scale projects. So I wanted to look at this on a national level, and especially a nation like the US, which is huge. And when I'm saying spaces of fear or safety, I'm thinking of it as a mutual interaction of people's identities with the spaces themselves to create this idea of fear or safety, and working with perception. I was really inspired by Jack King's work in A Queer New York, where he used sketch mapping and interviews as the primary methods for research of queer and trans spaces and experiences in New York City. Sketch map here from his website. In addition to pulling from the methods of Notes of a People's Atlas, which has been replicated across the world, but started in Chicago, I really liked the way that this form represented thoughts and emotions more prominently, but also the emphasis on the map as its own standalone product rather than aggregating it all together. But I will do both. For the methodology, I did 29 individual interviews with LGBTQIA+ Hofstra University students, including the I and the A there, just to get a broader range of people across the spectrum of queerness, I will say. These were semi-formal, open-ended, questioning structured interviews, and participants were asked to sketch map answers to specific questions. They were provided with specific symbols for each question and specific colors to go along with those questions. Here's the key that I used, hand-drawn, so that they didn't feel too pressured of like, it has to be perfect, because this isn't perfect. These symbols were chosen to represent the question if they could, like having a little suitcase for travel or having a heart for community. And different colors were assigned to differentiate between answers within the same kind of question. So like we can see within community, we have purple for current and pink for potential. Of course, this is a little bit flawed because they are close in colors, but it was the first attempt. So let's look at some maps. So this map, first off, this is my bias map. So I am also a queer woman, and this is where I perceived fear and safety as of October 1st of last year. And this was updated throughout the month of October. There's actually a reference of Pittsburgh from NACIS last year. And let's look at some of the participant maps. So this map was the first map, and off the bat, I realized there needs to be flexibility within this method. You can see here that there's yellow, and in the little key on the bottom, there's a note that says sundown towns. This is a map from a Black lesbian participant, and as a part of the perceptions of fear and unsafety within the United States, the idea of sundown towns were very prominent of, I could be killed if I was in one of these places once the sun goes down, in addition to being a queer woman. And here, this person, while drawing out the areas where they didn't feel safe or they wouldn't travel to because of laws like this, they were also reflecting like, there's just some places, no matter what, I wouldn't go to. So they used orange here and wrote it down on the bottom to clarify what it means. And we could see it mostly aligns with the exception of Florida, because that's where Disney is, and you gotta go to Disney. I also came across this idea of people not really having any idea of if they felt unsafe or if they felt safe in a place, or if they would feel safe going to these places, feeling unsure because they either hadn't seen news about it, they hadn't been to those places, they knew nobody from these places. So a new color was chosen, and now we have blue in the mix. This wasn't introduced to everybody, that way it could be a fair basis from the first few interviews that didn't have this color. But once somebody brought up that idea of, you know, I don't really know how I feel about this state, like I'm in between knowing, that's when the blue came out. And here we can also start seeing like the difference in how people interpret drawing on the maps. So here we have these very thick lines, but here we have these very aesthetic dotted borders. To here where we have a lot of drawing of very descriptive reasonings for why everything is classified the way it is. Going from something like, oh, Wyoming has a boring shape, going to something like, I'd be called slurs there. And as a Black gay man, that is an important distinction in terms of feeling unsafe in a place or not wanting to travel to a place. We also have people who they haven't traveled much within the US, they haven't seen much news, they have really little to pull from, and it's not even at a level where it's unsure, it's just there is no thought, there is no perception about the rest of the country. But even here, we can still see patterns that are throughout, like Texas and Florida being marked, even though has never really been near Texas. And then we also can go here where we see differences in how people emphasize emotions relating to place. Like with Florida, where the person, as they were drawing, they said, you know, I feel like I really don't like Florida. I was like, okay, color it in. They colored it in and it still didn't feel right. So they pulled out the black marker. They're like, yeah, I think this feels better. In addition to adding the no-go, pointing to Texas and Florida. And then going to this one where this participant said the entire country felt unsafe with the exception of where they grew up and where they currently were in New York, because they presented as a woman, they were pretty small, frail looking, and they were disabled, and that added to this idea of unsafety. And it's those layers that add on to these stories that we see, this texture of experience. And I know what you're thinking. How are we gonna combine these maps into like one map? Which, you know, kind of arbitrary, but you know, it's a great question still, and I appreciate you for asking. So I did 2 ways of tabulating the data. So the first way was doing some grid maps, where I made tables that counted the mentions of community, places of travel, and where people had lived. And I placed these features into a grid map for clarity of data. As you can see, a lot of points are in the Northeast, and if you've ever looked at a map of the United States, there is not enough space to properly see all those points. So this helps to be able to compare things a lot better, just in terms of the points themselves. And then for community, same thing. I wanted to tie in the little sketching of the hearts, so that's on the top as well. And then to map out the fear, safety, and uncertainty, I wanted to go with choropleths. So I created layers in ArcGIS Pro with the states highlighted as such, and digitized the in-state divisions that people had made. And what this is referring to is when some people were sketching, sometimes like New York, for instance, they would say, I feel safe in New York City and Long Island because I know these places, I know the culture, and it's always been like the kind of thing I knew I'd be safe here. But the rest of the state, I have no idea what's in there. Or I've seen Confederate flags up there. I don't feel safe. So I used count overlapping features to then count when they overlap, the layers. And this allows for us to account for those small digitized cuts of states. Otherwise, I would have used Excel. If you want to replicate this, use Excel if you're not having to digitize small parts. And that's where these maps come from. If you want to see them more in depth, you can look at the paper, which I will talk about in the end. So just to conclude, legislation did have an impact on how people perceived fear, safety, and community in areas, which occurred when legislation was proposed and when it actually was passed. This research helps to establish insight on the ability to use sketch mapping on a large scale, but there has to be specific guidelines with that. And I think there's still a lot of room to grow and to experiment with how do you adapt the texture of a sketch map experience into an aggregated data set. And continuing with these sketch map reflections, it's not just about the data, but about the process and integrating the interviewee into that data creation phase and having it as, yes, your story, how you want to represent it is data on its own. I don't have to do anything. And seeing the joy that people had in talking about and drawing out these parts of their lives and their experiences, which for some of them they had never really done because either they had recently discovered and adopted their identity, or they were in a place where they were not safe to do so before. And it was also interesting seeing the way that people interacted with these maps, being very careful, like, oh, I don't want to mess up your data, I don't want to mess up your map. To which I always tell them, you can't mess up your own story because my data is your story. You can't mess it up, it's impossible. There are limitations to this, such as the ability to generalize results with the size and the diversity of the population that I had access to for this. There was no data that I collected on the pre-existing factors of leaving home, regardless of these laws. And going further, and then in terms of time, there's just not really much time to run multiple rounds of interviews in order to adapt the questions based on what I saw from the beginning rounds, like this idea of uncertainty. These are some references. Once I figure out Slack, I will post this in there so you can take a bigger look at this. And then I'm open for questions and comments. Here's my contact, that's my email. I'm available on Slack. Take a picture, I have put my photo, that way you can't forget whose information this is. My LinkedIn, I have posted the sketch maps for this alongside with the paper, but there is also the link to the paper on the Hofstra University Honors Thesis website. It just does not have the maps in it yet. I have to edit it. But yeah, open for questions.
And we do have time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so like throughout your studies, did you, when people would respond to the questions off from that, were there places in the country where people perhaps felt unsafe because of their gender identity or sexual identity, but they felt safe because of other identities, such as disability status, race?
So what I will say to this is that it happened within the community aspect. I might have one of them in here, so we'll go back while I ask this. But basically the question, it was up there. Did people express feeling unsafe in an area, but unsafe in an area due to gender or sexuality, but safe in regards to a different part of their identity? And that did happen in terms of community, where people would, okay, yeah, we can see over here, so like Texas, you can see like there's a little cut right around Houston. So like specific cities would pop out as like, oh, I don't think I'd feel safe in this entire state, with the exception of a place like Austin or like Houston, in New York, a place like New York City. or Florida, it's like, oh, but Disney's fine. Like, I'm fine at Disney, but the rest of the state, no. Yeah, so people would do cuts within it, but they would usually highlight if they had community, if they knew people there, or if they knew of communities that were there. I had somebody who mentioned like furries, and like there's a big furry community in one area, so they thought that they'd feel safe there, but like the rest of the state kind of know. So yeah, that's what I would say in regards to that. Yes.
I like your talk. I think I'm also curious about like the symbolic nature of this, because I think about like how some of the things can affect how people would have made this map, like in the 80s and 90s, and think about spaces that people would have marked as safe in during this project, but they could have been the most dangerous kind of disease during like that time period. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so thoughts on kind of the differences in how this project could look in different contextual times for queer communities. This was actually a conversation I had with Clancy Wilmot last year about like looking at this with different generations considered, and like how they experienced space now and in the past. I've thought about it. I will not be moving forward with it. I'm looking at disability likely as a research topic moving forward. But I think it's really interesting to think about also just the difference in what community means and how that can impact if you feel fearful or safe in a place, like having access to digital communities and being able to find your identity a lot earlier on because there's more access to the language now. So I think there is an interesting space to look at it from a generational point of view.
Another great talk. Thank you so much, Natalie.